She had been walking for 3 days when she saw the ranch. Her name was Lily, and she was 17 years old, and she had not eaten in 2 of those 3 days. The dust of the trail had settled into her skin, into her hair, into the cracks of her lips. Her boots were worn through, and her feet were bleeding, and she had no idea where she was going, except that she could not go back. Behind her was a town that had taken everything from her mother, her hope. Ahead of her was nothing but dust and sky, until she crested a ridge and saw the house in the valley below. The ranch was not much to look at. A single-story house with a sagging porch, a barn that leaned to one side, a corral with 3 horses that watched her approach with curious eyes. But smoke rose from the chimney, and a light burned in the window, and to Lily, it looked like a palace. She had been turned away from 2 farms already. The doors closed in her face before she could finish her question. She stood at the gate, her hands trembling, her throat tight, and she wondered if she had the strength to be turned away again. The door opened before she could knock. A man stood in the doorway, tall and lean, with gray in his hair and lines on his face that spoke of years in the sun. He was not young, but he was not old either, somewhere in the middle where a man had seen enough of life to know its weight. He looked at her without speaking, his eyes moving over her torn dress, her bleeding feet, her face that was too thin and too young to carry the exhaustion she wore. He did not ask who she was. He did not ask where she came from. "What do you need?" he asked. His voice was quiet, rough, the voice of a man who did not use it often. Lily opened her mouth to give the speech she had rehearsed, the one about being grateful, about not being trouble, about leaving at first light. But the words would not come. Her throat closed and her eyes filled, and she stood there like a fool, unable to speak, unable to move. She waited for the door to close. She waited for him to turn her away like the others had. He did not close the door. He stepped out onto the porch, moving slowly, carefully, like a man approaching a frightened animal. He stopped at the top of the steps, keeping his distance, and he waited. He did not rush her. He did not push her. He simply stood there, patient, and let her find her voice. When she finally spoke, her voice was a whisper, cracked and thin. "I need somewhere to sleep, just for tonight. I'll be gone in the morning. I won't be any trouble." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something pass through his eyes, something that looked like recognition, like memory, like a wound that had healed but left a scar. He nodded slowly, then turned and walked back into the house, leaving the door open behind him. She did not know if she was supposed to follow. She stood at the bottom of the steps, frozen, until his voice came from inside. "Well, you planning to sleep on the porch?" She climbed the steps on legs that did not want to hold her. The door opened into a kitchen, warm and small, with a fire burning in the hearth and a pot of something that smelled like heaven simmering on the stove. He was already at the counter, pulling down a bowl, filling it with stew. He set it on the table without a word, then pointed to a chair. "Sit." She sat. The stew was thick with meat and potatoes, and she tried to eat slowly, to be polite, but her hands would not stop shaking, and before she knew it, the bowl was empty. He filled it again without being asked. She ate the second bowl more slowly, her eyes on the table, her face burning with shame. She could not remember the last time someone had fed her without wanting something in return. When she finished, he took the bowl, washed it, and set it on the counter. Then he turned to her, his face serious, and asked a question she had been dreading. "Where are you from?" She told him. "A small town 2 days east, a place she would never see again." He did not ask why she left. He did not ask what had happened to her family, to her home, to the life she had left behind. He simply nodded, as if he understood without needing the words. Then he pointed toward a door at the end of the hall. "There's a room through there. It's not much, but the bed's clean and the window faces east. You'll see the sunrise." She stood, her legs unsteady, and then she stopped. There was one question she had not asked. one question she had been too afraid to ask the others. She turned back to him, her hands clasped in front of her, her voice barely audible. "Where will you sleep?" The question hung in the air between them. She had learned, in the weeks since she had left her home, that kindness always came with a price. The man who gave her bread wanted something in return. The woman who offered her a ride wanted her to work for days without pay. She was waiting for the cost, the condition, the things she would have to give up in exchange for this warmth, this food, this kindness. He looked at her, and for a moment, she saw something crack in his expression. Not anger, not hunger. Something softer, sadder. He took a step toward her, and she flinched, an old habit she could not control. He stopped immediately, raising his hands, showing her his palms. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said quietly. "I'm not going to ask you for anything. You asked where I'll sleep. I'll sleep on the floor by the fire. I've slept in worse places. The bed is yours." She stared at him, waiting for the catch, waiting for the words that would follow, the words that always followed. But he said nothing else. He walked to the hearth, took a blanket from a hook, and spread it on the floor in front of the fire. Then he lay down, his back to her, his breathing slow and even, as if sleeping on a hard floor was something he did every night. She stood in the doorway of the room, watching him, and for the first time in weeks, she did not feel afraid. The room was small, barely large enough for the bed and a wash basin, but the sheets were clean and the pillows smelled of lavender. She sat on the edge of the bed, her feet dangling, her hands in her lap. Through the thin walls, she could hear his breathing, steady and calm. She thought about the men who had looked at her with hunger in their eyes, the women who had seen her as something to be used, the town that had turned its back when her mother died and left her with nothing. She had stopped believing that there were good people left in the world. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Sunlight was streaming through the window, just as he had promised, painting the room in shades of gold. She lay still for a moment, letting the warmth soak into her bones, letting herself pretend that this was her life, that this was her home. Then the sounds from the kitchen brought her back. She dressed quickly, smoothing her hair, preparing herself for what would come next. Kindness did not last. She knew that. By noon, she would be on the road again. He was at the stove when she came into the kitchen, flipping eggs with a steady hand. He glanced at her, nodded toward the table where a plate was already waiting. "Eat." She sat, not knowing what else to do. He served her eggs and bacon and thick slices of bread, and when she hesitated, he sat across from her with his own plate and began to eat. "I'm Thomas," he said between bites. "I don't know your name," she told him. He nodded, as if filing it away, and continued eating. No questions, no demands. She finished her breakfast, and then she waited. She waited for him to tell her what she owed him. She waited for him to name the price of the bed, the food, the kindness. She waited for the moment when his eyes would change, when his voice would harden, when she would have to run again. But he simply took her plate, washed it with his own, and set it on the counter. Then he picked up his hat from the hook by the door and looked at her. "There's work to do. Fences need mending. You want to earn your breakfast. You can help." She followed him outside, and for the first time, she saw the ranch in the daylight. The house was older than she had thought, the paint peeling, the porch sagging. The barn needed a new roof, and the fences were falling down in more places than they stood. But the horses were healthy, and the garden was green, and there was something about the place that felt like it was waiting for something, like it was holding on. Thomas handed her a hammer and pointed to a fence post. "Start there. I'll be by the barn." She worked through the morning, and then through the afternoon, and then through the week. She did not plan to stay. Each morning, she told herself she would leave. Each evening, she found herself still there. Thomas did not ask her to stay. He did not ask her to leave. He simply gave her work and food and a bed, and he slept on the floor by the fire every night, never once stepping through her door. never once looking at her with anything but the same quiet kindness he had shown her on that first night. One evening, as the sun was setting behind the ridge, she found him on the porch, staring out at the valley. She sat beside him, not speaking, and after a long silence, he spoke. "I had a daughter once. She would have been about your age." He did not look at her. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, on something she could not see. She died. A fever. A long time ago. Her mother died the same winter. I've been alone ever since. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough. "When you knocked on my door, I thought maybe it was time to stop being alone." She stayed. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. She learned to mend fences and tend horses and cook his mother's recipes from the old book on the shelf. He taught her to read better, to write her name in a hand that grew steadier with each lesson. They worked together in the garden, ate together at the table, sat together on the porch as the sun went down. He never asked her to call him anything but Thomas. He never asked her to be anything but what she was. And one morning, when the first snow of winter dusted the valley, she woke in her room and heard him moving in the kitchen, making coffee, starting the fire. She lay in bed, listening to the sounds of a home that had become hers, and she smiled. She had walked for 3 days with nothing but dust in her lungs and despair in her heart. She had knocked on a door, expecting nothing but another door closing. And a man who had lost everything had opened it, given her a bed, and asked for nothing in return. The girl who had nothing found a place where she belonged. The man who had lost everything found someone to come home to. And all because of a question that was really a prayer. Where will I sleep?